Hello, everybody. My clock says 3 o'clock, so I say it's time to start the webinar. I'm Mike Cloughesy, Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be your host for today's webinar, Carbon in Oregon's Managed Forest. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. And we'd like to give a special shout out today to Clackamas Extension and OFRI for leading this project, and in particular for Julie Woodward and Amanda Brenner. Amanda is manning the chat today. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled the first and third Tuesday of each month at 3 p.m. from now until June 15th. And we're gonna definitely shut down from the summer. And we're looking at having a meeting in April to figure out what we're going to do in the fall. We'll probably continue something, but probably be a little different. It's kind of surprising. We started this a year ago because Tree School Live, which would have been this Saturday, was canceled because of COVID. And so we all thought we would do it, in the spring. We did it. We ended up doing it in the fall, and we've been doing it every other week since September, just about. So it's been interesting. We've had a lot of attendance. It's been good, but I think we'd all like to get back to face-to-face teaching and face-to-face learning. But anyway, welcome for being here today. As you can see, we're using Zoom as our medium, and the key to Zoom is the Zoom toolbar. And on most computers, it's on the bottom of the screen. On some Apples and iPads and such, it's on the top. And in some, you don't even see it until you scroll over it. But when you scroll over it, the big thing you should be looking for is the Q&A. That's where we're putting our questions, and then we will answer them. As a participant, you don't have access to audio or video, so you don't need to worry about that. The other thing besides the Q&A is the chat. And you've probably seen Amanda is sending messages in your chat to let you know what's up with our webinar today. There will be many links in there to resources, talk about credits, talk about future webinars, all that kind of stuff will be in the chat. But for asking questions of our panelists, we ask that you put it in the Q&A. The other thing we're going to be using is the polls, and you'll get a chance in a few minutes to take your first poll. And when I start the poll, it should just automatically pop up on your screen. If it doesn't, there should be in the toolbar a poll button, and it will light up when the poll's available for some types of Zoom. But for most people, it just pops up in the middle. The final thing is we are recording this. We record all of these webinars, and they're available on the Tree School Online page, on Know Your Forest, and on Extension. So you should be able to find them all, and Amanda will post a link throughout the day of where they're found. So at that point, I'm going to tell you about today's program. As you can see from the slide, it's Carbon in Oregon's Managed Forests. We have 3 presenters. Myself will do the introduction, and I will kind of set the stage for the project. Then we're going to have Dr. Edie Sonne Hall is going to talk about how to manage your forests to sequester more carbon and what some of the ideas there are. And then David Ford from LNC Carbon is going to talk about carbon markets and incentive program. We'll have a couple times where we break for questions, but you can put your questions in anytime, and I'll be moderating that. So I'm going to switch. This slide is supposed to remind me that it's poll time. So I will open our first poll, and this poll has 5 questions, but they're all easy ones. First question, where are you from? Willamette Valley, Southwest, East Side, Washington State, USA, outside the USA. About yourself, are you a woodland owner, private natural resource professional, agency natural resource professional, nonprofit natural resource professional, or other? Then we want to know how many acres of forest land do you own or manage, all the way from 0 to 1,000 plus. Then we have 2 questions, particularly about carbon. Question 4 is, are you interested in managing for increased carbon sequestration? And question 5 is, if an incentive program to increase carbon sequestration was available, would you be interested? And so far, it's coming along pretty good. So far, everybody's interested, and almost everybody's interested in managing for carbon, but everyone's interested in incentives. So I'll let this run for a couple minutes. We've got 43 in the audience, and usually I let it run for a minute, and we'll have 80%. And right now, it's a minute 5, and we have 86%. I'm going to end the polling there, and I will share the results so you can see who you are. Pretty typical for tree school, 71% from the Willamette Valley, a few from Southwest, a few from the East Side, 1 from Washington State, no one from anywhere else, just Washington and Oregon. Mostly woodland owners, 58%, but also some agency natural resource professionals, some others, some nonprofits and private. And this one is not mutually exclusive. You could be a woodland owner and a nonprofit natural resource professional. Acres, again, right about the usual, 40 to 100 gets the most, but we have in all the categories, all the way from people that don't have any to people that have 1,000 plus. So pretty good reach, really interesting distribution. 97% are interested in managing for increased carbon sequestration. So, Edie, your job is to get the one person that's not interested by the end of this webinar, okay? I know you can do that. And again, 97% are interested in incentive programs if they're available. So this is your job, David. By the end of the show, we have to have that be 100. So you got one person, you each have one person you're targeting, but I know you're targeting all of us. So I'm going to stop there. And thank you for participating in our poll. And this is really helpful to us. We've tracked these over time. We ask some of the same questions in every webinar. So what are we covering today? We're talking about carbon in Oregon's managed forests. And this was a project done by OFRI, funded by OFRI, done by the team we'll meet and talk about. It was a science review and a summary to set the benchmark for where we are today in carbon in Oregon's forests, how we manage for it, how we incentivize for it, how much goes into wood, how much wood products matter. We're looking at all of those. We wanted to synthesize the current information on carbon sequestration, particularly in Oregon's working forests. And by working forests, we mean managed forests, where trees are cut down, forest products are produced. So we're not just looking at wilderness and reserves. We're doing this with recognition that climate change is happening. We're doing it that increased carbon is happening. We're recognizing that. And that one of the keys, or two of the keys, to helping this problem of too much carbon in the atmosphere is through managing our forests differently and using wood products more effectively. We believe that the real key is intentional forest management. We can get carbon in our ecosystems, but by managing them intentionally, we can get more carbon. As most OFRI projects, those of you that are familiar with OFRI, we like to do outreach on it. So we've done quite a bit. We have a carbon webpage set up on OregonForest.org/carbon, where you can access all the materials we talk about today, and it summarizes it really well just on that one page. We have the science review, which is available in the resources that are on the page for you that Amanda has set up. We have the full science review. You can download it right there, or you can go to the carbon webpage and download it. And this is not a hefty book. It's only 117 pages, 121 pages, but it does a pretty good job of summarizing where we're at with carbon in Oregon's managed forest. Then we have a summary report, which is a shorter, slick, typical OFRI version. It does it all in 16 pages. So you can get a lot of information in a little bit, and it's available. And then we have a couple of fun things. On our webpage, Jordan Benner developed this carbon bits. They're little videos, 90-second videos that are on our webpage, and the photosynthesis is there right now. Over time, we'll have more there, and we've been doing a social media campaign outreach using these carbon bits. So it's kind of fun. We like to make it fun, but it's also very serious and very important. So what was covered in the science review? We gave an overview of carbon and forests in Chapter 1, which was co-written by myself and Edie. Chapter 2, we did carbon sequestration and storage in Oregon's forests. And this is a summary of some work done by the Forest Service, Forest Inventory and Analysis. They've done a report for the state of Oregon that was funded by the Board of Forestry, Department of Forestry, does a really good job. And Glenn Christensen wrote this chapter to summarize that report. Tons of good stuff in there, and I will be summarizing some of that in the PowerPoint today. Chapter 3, managing forests to increase their carbon storage, productivity, and resiliency. And Edie Sonne Hall wrote this chapter, and it's excellent, and she'll be covering that in the PowerPoint today. Chapter 4 is on the role of wood products and biomass energy in carbon storage and emissions. And this was written by Maureen Putman with a co-author of Bruce Lipke from University of Washington. And I'm going to give just a couple of their tidbits, but it's a whole lot of good information. But we tried to target this webinar towards family forest landowners, and we figured the two most important topics for you was how to manage the forest for increasing carbon sequestration and how to make some money doing it. So that's what we focused on. Chapter 5 is on harvested wood products, the accounting. Edie wrote this chapter, and it's really only partially done because we were waiting for a report, another report that Department of Forestry funded on the amount of carbon that's stored in wood products, and that wasn't finished at the time we went to press back in June. It is finished now. So next year, July, August, September, I'm going to be working on a revision of our book and add that information in there. And then the final chapter, Chapter 6, David Ford wrote with Sheldon Zakreski as a co-author, Current and Future Markets for Carbon and Co-Benefits from Oregon Forests. And David will be summarizing that chapter today. So here's our esteemed group of authors and co-authors. But I want to start off with to kind of put this in context. So this is some data put together by Dr. Dave Cleaves with the Forest Climate Working Group. And what it looks at is for the Western states and then the total US, it looks at how much sequestration is happening in the forest, what percent is that of the total US, the amount of emissions, what percent that is of the total US CO2 emissions, and then what percent the carbon dioxide sequestration is of the CO2 emissions. So when we talk sequestration, we're talking about the change in carbon, and I'll cover more on that, but we always talk about it in, at least we do, in million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And the reason we do that is we're comparing it to the emissions. And the number one greenhouse gas that we're concerned about is carbon dioxide. So we try to talk always about emissions and sequestration in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So we'll just look at Oregon for this. Oregon, every year we sequester 34.3 million metric tons CO2 equivalent of carbon. That represents 6% of the carbon sequestered by forests in the whole US. Also, every year, our emissions are 37.9 million metric tons, which only represents 0.7% of the total emissions in the US. So as you might expect, Oregon is a big forest state, so we sequester a lot of the carbon that's sequestered in the country. We're not a big population state, so our emissions are relatively small. Let's compare this to California, our state to the south. Again, a pretty big carbon sequesterer, although with all the wildfires, they've been sequestering less, 13.7 million metric tons. But they're a huge emitter, no doubt, right? All those cars, all those factories. 7% of the CO2 emitted in this country are from California. Washington to our north, again, a great forest sequesterer, 27 million metric tons, and a moderate emitter. So the final column, this is my favorite because it looks at how do we compare the amount of sequestration to the amount of emissions. And if we're going to get balanced, right, we're going to have to be sequestering as much carbon as we emit. And so we're going at this two different ways. One is they're trying to emit less. Second, we're trying to sequester more. So in Oregon already, just our baseline today, 90% of the CO2 emitted we're sequestering in our carbon, in our forest. Whereas if we look for the whole country, it's only 11%. For Washington, it's 33%. California, 3.7%. Several of these states are negative, and these are particularly Western states that have huge forest fires and lots of forest health issues. They have emissions from their forests rather than sequestration. So this is the kind of thing we use as a background. So as we look at this, FIA, as I said, we're summarizing the work they did in Oregon. They've also done studies recently in Washington and California, and you can kind of get a feel. Here we're looking at carbon storage, not in CO2 equivalents, but just in carbon. So Oregon, 3.2 billion metric tons, California, 3.2 billion, Washington, 2.7 billion. So pretty good storage in all three states. But when we look at sequestration, which is the change in storage each year, Oregon definitely outpaces both Washington and California. And actually the California numbers, I think, are getting lower because of the amount of fire that they're having. The other thing that they did in this study was they looked at where the forest carbon was being stored, meaning what part of the forest. And by far of this 3.2 billion metric tons of carbon that's stored in our forests, 49% of it is in the forest soils, 32% in live trees, 7% in roots, 5% in dead wood, 4% in litter, 2% in snags, and 1% in understory vegetation. So that two big pools that managing is important on is the soil and the live trees. And what we tend to focus on is the live trees, but it's important to recognize that 49%, almost half of the carbon stored in our forest ecosystem, is in the soil. So things we do to keep forests in forest, to keep soil on the hillsides, those are all helping helping manage our carbon stores. So that's important. The other thing they looked at is who owns the carbon. They looked at who owns the forest, but they looked at who owns the carbon. And it's pretty clear that if you know who owns the forest, you're going to know who owns the carbon. So U.S. Forest Service has almost 50% of the land base of Oregon's forests, and they have over 50% of the carbon is on Forest Service land. Large private has 23% of the forest land in Oregon and just under 20% of the carbon. Small woodland owners like you all have about 14% of the land base and about 11% of the carbon. So the one thing that this jumps out at you here is when the blue bars are higher than the green bars, it's kind of the overachievers. And what it tends to mean is there's more wood on the stump in those places. The other thing it looks at is sequestration. Again, we talked about storage is what the last two slides were about. And this is looking at the sequestration. Our net, and we always talk about flux, which is change. And flux has, if it's a plus, then you're having more carbon stored, that's sequestration. If it's negative and you're losing carbon to the atmosphere, that's emission. So of the carbon that's being stored, the biggest increase is in above ground live. Above ground dead, we're actually losing carbon to it because dead trees are decomposing. So that's an interesting one that we look at. But overall, it's pretty positive. Soil is a little on the negative side overall. And the final thing to look at what they looked at in the flux, this is in the FIA study, is what happens to it. So each year you grow so much carbon and something's going to happen to it. So we have our gross growth, which is here in green, and then it can be harvested, it can be cut, it can be lost to fire, it can be lost to insects and disease. So the black dot is the mean, the net. So each year on corporate, it increases a little. We have a great deal of growth, but we also have a great deal of harvest. On the small woodlands, it increases a bit more, and this is on a per acre basis. because we have a great deal of growth, not near as much harvest. On small woodlands, the harvest is only about 50% of the growth, where it's more like 77% of the growth on the corporate. When we get over here to the Forest Service, a whole lot of growth and not as much harvest. Instead, we have a lot of fire, a lot of insects and disease, and a lot of natural mortality. So overall, we are increasing, but one of the interesting things about when you just look at this, and this is why it was very important that we also look at the wood, is this analysis here in this graph shows harvest as a negative because it's no longer out there on the ecosystem, but it is still storing carbon. And that's where the wood products come in. And this chart shows carbon stored in metric tons, thousands of metric tons. And this is just in single family housing stock, how it's changed over time. From 1980, we had this huge, this was the housing boom, you remember, and then this was the recession, and this is the recovery. So each year, we're adding to the amount of carbon that's stored in those houses. And carbon that's stored in wood products is not in the atmosphere. So it's important. The other thing that they looked at in the chapter that Maureen and Bruce did is again, you assume that you have this carbon in the logs when you harvest it. Well, what happens to that stuff? It really matters. It's different than sending it to a landfill or burning it up. So we bring in logs covered with bark, take them to a sawmill. Of that, 44% goes to lumber, 56% goes to chips and other products. For the chips and other products, 22% of that 56% is wood energy, which goes back to the sawmill, so they don't have to use other energy. And then the rest goes either into pulp or paper or wood composite products. Wood composite products are still storing the carbon. So this is things like particle board, oriented strand board, medium density fiber board. A lot of the siding products are wood composite products. It's storing a lot of carbon for a long time. So we can't just look at lumber and plywood. So why that makes a difference leads us to this slide. So again, here, when we talked about the sequestration, one of the things we looked at was removals for the forest. So every year in the forest in Oregon, we said we had a net sequestration of 30.9 million metric tons. It started out a lot bigger than that, but we were taking 35.9 million metric tons, moving it into wood products. So of that, 10 million metric tons goes into storage in wood products, which is 28% of the removals. But if we also look at the co-products, it totals 18%, 51% of the removals. So to this 30.9 million metric tons of sequestration, we add that to make it a total of 41. We add 11, or we add almost 20. So it's pretty significant. You know, we added 10.2 or 18.6. So here, rather than just talking about sequestration in our forests of 30.9 million metric tons, the total sequestration, including wood products, is almost 50. So that's even more significant and would really jump out at us. So I know your heads are spinning. But I just wanted to whet your appetite to the amount of information that's out there and the importance of two things: the importance of managing our forests and the importance of having wood products. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Edie to come. And Dr. Edie Sonne Hall, welcome. Really happy that you're part of our team both today and in this project. Edie is the founder and principal of Three Trees Consulting, over 20 years experience in connections to regional, national, North American, and global forest sustainability issues. Before she started her consultancy, she worked for Weyerhaeuser in Sustainable Forests and Product Group. She has a PhD from University of Washington, and she is just a really smart person. So Edie is starting up her PowerPoint, and she's going to tell us, how do we manage our forests to sequester more carbon? It always takes a minute or two longer than you think it should to do this part.
It sure does, because once you try the share, then it doesn't actually show up.
Okay, yeah, I know it's really weird. Okay, your PowerPoint's up. You just need to start it.
Well, first of all, thank you guys. This is really an exciting opportunity. I appreciate being here at this tree school, which I kind of feel like this is a little bit of an oxymoron to be talking into a computer at tree school. So everybody take a deep breath and think of their favorite tree and let's channel that. The second thing is I appreciate the complexity that I'm about to impart on you. You just got a little bit of a flavor from Mike about the biogenic carbon cycle, and I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. And I don't expect you to think that this is like the easiest thing in the world. If your head is spinning, also take a deep breath and channel that your favorite tree. So my name is Edie Sonne Hall, and I'm one of the co-editors of this report and the author of 2 chapters. I have my PhD from the University of Washington, and I am currently a consultant that is working on carbon, climate change, forest, and wood product accounting for a whole bunch of different projects. I work at the state, national, international level for industry, government, nonprofits. I write reports, research organizations, you name it. I'm also a small family tree farmer myself. I am a 4th generation tree farmer in South Carolina, Loblolly Pine. And my husband and I own property in north central Washington that suffered damage from the 2015 wildfire season, which at the time was Washington's largest wildfire season. We have obviously experienced lots of fires across the Pacific Northwest since then. So I'm going to talk to you about opportunities for Oregon's forests to help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to make sure that this is the opportunities at the state level. So some of these opportunities may or may not be available to your particular forest, but I wanted to give an overview of what are the big buckets of opportunities at the state level. So first, I'm going to take a little bit of time to set the stage about where carbon is, in what form and why, and then we'll walk through some specific strategies. So before your head starts spinning yet again, I'm going to cut to the punchline and let you know that really the main thing you need to do is focus on having healthy, resilient, productive forests, which hopefully you are already doing, and the carbon will follow. So let's set the stage. Okay. There's a lot on this screen. I'm going to distill it to a little bit of things. There's carbon in 4 major pools. There's carbon in the atmosphere. There's carbon in the vegetation, soils, and the actual vegetation above ground. There's carbon in the ocean, and there's carbon in the fossil fuel reserves, which on a time scale used to be obviously vegetation. Fossil fuels is just a one-way street. Both the ocean and the land are what I call two-way streets with the atmosphere. So they can both take in carbon out of the atmosphere, and they can also release it back into the atmosphere. Now, the ocean and atmosphere two-way street is really largely driven by chemistry. So the more there is in the ocean, you want to have an exchange such that there's the same amount in each pool, relatively speaking. The land atmosphere exchange, we know all about this. Photosynthesis, vegetation takes in carbon dioxide when it grows and then releases it upon either decomposition, decay, or combustion. So this is how this goes on an annual basis. There are a couple key pieces of information and words that you might want to pick out of this. So a pool is where things are stored, also known as a stock. The fluxes or flows are the exchanges in between the two. If you have a net flux, that is the net change in between, say, the atmosphere and vegetation. And that also can be known as a carbon stock change. Currently, both the atmosphere and the ocean are on an annual basis a net sink. But there is a lot of variation depending on where you are in the world and what your main drivers are. So what does that mean for a forest? So as we know, forests and carbon are always in flux. There's always growth and there's always release upon decombustion, decay. The difference can be very variable. You can either have more growth than you have release, or vice versa. So for example, an old growth forest that does not have any disturbance has a negligible flux. So there's a lot of carbon that's stored there, but in any given year, there's not a whole lot of exchanges with the atmosphere. Likewise, a forest that has just been harvested and now is regrowing will get to a stage where there's a lot of new growth on there. The state of Oregon has forests that are in all different stages. Some are growing, some have just been harvested, some are overstocked and unhealthy and succumbing to mortality. These contributions are also impacted by a combination of nature, so disturbances and natural factors, preconditions, the age of the trees, and also management. And so what we're trying to do is hone in on what that management piece could be. So how does this all fit into the climate piece? Well, while there's a lot of net impact that's influenced by nature, humans are able to temper or leverage the impact. So this chart describes the generally accepted strategies for how the forest sector can help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. So these are broadly, you take more carbon out of the atmosphere. You can do that by planting more trees. You can do that by increasing carbon stocks in existing forests, and you can do that by increasing the carbon stocks that are in the harvested wood products. Additionally, you can focus on reducing emissions from the atmosphere, either by reducing emissions from deforestation or land degradation or emissions from wildfire, or by reducing fossil fuel emissions by using biomass for energy or by using wood as opposed to other materials that have a higher energy impact. Require more energy to manufacture. Oregon is blessed with some of the best structural material in the world. And as a result, it's actually the largest manufacturer of saw timber in the US. And the US is the largest manufacturer of saw timber in the world. Now, I am going to be focused in this talk on these four strategies, the strategies on the land. Mike gave a little bit of a flavor of what the wood product strategy is, and more of that is in chapter 4 in the report. So let's talk about the strategies on land. The first strategy, reduce forest land conversion. So when you convert forest land to another use, you're changing that average amount of carbon that's stored on a land from a lot in a forest to a little in, say, agriculture or a paved parking lot. These graphs show forest area and forest carbon loss gain in the US over time. So as you can see, there was a large reduction in forest area in this between 1630 and sort of 1930, as there was overgrown for farming. The entire East Coast basically went out of forest. And since then, forest land area has been stable or increasing. This also coincided with carbon loss. So over here on the right, we have the carbon stock exchange over time in the US. And you can see for the few hundred years in the beginning, before sort of industrial and humans on a significant basis impacted forests in the US, the carbon stock was basically a net zero. So, you know, in any given time, forests were growing. Some forests had a big stand replacing fire, but generally speaking, there was zero net sequestration. Then that resulted in a huge period of carbon loss as both carbon was lost, forest area was lost, and there was no ability to regrow, and a drawdown of large old trees into some smaller trees. But since then, since about 1950, there has been a trend to be a large net sink. So forests have been regrowing back in the east. There's been stabilization of carbon across the west, and in most states, the forests are a net sink, save for the states that Mike pointed out that have some serious issues with mortality and fire. So what does that mean for the US? So right now we're a huge net sink, but the Forest Service predicts that that's actually going to change potentially. And a lot of it is due to forest loss predictions in the US. So this is a graph that shows the forest loss predictions by 2060, according to the US Forest Service. And you can see that the US South has the largest amount that is vulnerable, mainly for development. Pacific Northwest, not as much, and I will get into specifically in Oregon as to why that is. So you guys probably know Oregon's doing pretty well. And the part of it, and a lot of it, is due to the Oregon Conservation and Development Act of 1973, which set in motion a series of strategies for reducing loss to development, including growth management zoning. So as of 2009, 460,000 acres of all the lands zoned as developable were still in either forest, range, or agricultural use. So those are still able to be developed, but they are still in forest right now. However, population density has increased. And one study shows that as population in nearby areas grow, the probability of forest management lessens. So what can you do about that? Well, there are some general policies to incentivize keeping forests working. These include preferential tax programs, voluntary incentives such as transfer of development rights, and even NRCS cost share programs to help reduce the cost of forest management. So try to keep your forest in a forest and think of ways that we can have that incentive be there. Second strategy, reduce the risk of uncharacteristic fires and diseases. So IPCC, which is the large scientific international body, predicts that climate change is going to result in an increase in extreme weather and climate events. And we have experienced these. You can see that the ones in bold are what there's predicted to increase: heat waves, floods, wildflower fires, heavy precipitation, etc. The biggest risks in Oregon are fire, insects, drought, and heavy precipitation events. Has anyone experienced any of these anytime in the last few years? Remember, you can't pin a single event on climate change, but together the increases really lend itself to be more likely. Now, the risk of all of these really do depend on specific ecozones and specific areas. So even in the eastern Oregon, where there's generally drier, larger fire intervals, there is a different zone and a different risk of fire intervals depending on where you are in the mountains and how your elevation is. And in Western Oregon, though the fire interval is usually very long, you can have a perfect storm of events like what happened last summer. Extremely dry summer, the soil moisture goes out, heavy winds, flame, and then you have a catastrophic event. On the insect side, on our right, the risks of insects increase with warmer winters, which extend the life cycle of these insects and disease agents. Nationally, the U.S. Forest Service predicts that 81 million acres of forests are at risk of losing greater than 25% of their basal area due to mortality of insects and disease over the next 15 years. This is the reduction of the equivalent of about 77 million metric tons of CO2 per year, which seems like it's about the state of Washington's total greenhouse gas emissions, although I have a feeling that Washington has increased since those numbers, Mike. I think it's closer to 100. There are a lot of people in Washington now. So what do you do about it? Well, this very much depends on geographic location. So in general, overstock stands in regions that are subject to increasing fire can benefit from a combination of thinning and prescribed fire. There's been a lot of research on this, and it really does depend on the stocking of your stand right now and also the risk of fire. But there's a lot of potential savings that can be done by thinning and prescribed fire to increase resilience for fire. And 1.8 million tons of CO2 is a potential savings that's been estimated for the state of Oregon. Okay, now we're moving on to increasing storage. So land strategy 3, plant more trees. This is a really big one. And there's a lot of potential both globally and also in the US. But it is not just generally preferred to just go out and plant trees anywhere. There's the best potential for co-benefits are in lands that have been previously forested. So Oregon's potential areas, riparian buffers and farmlands and pasture, understock stands from fire-prone areas, lands that are not naturally regenerating after a high severity fire, cue the picture to the right here, and urban reforestation. There is a really great website that I've linked here called the Reforestation Hub that has looked at spatially explicit opportunities by state, the specific amount of acres and the specific types that are potentially available for reforestation. So I've listed what it is for the state of Oregon. Now, how can these be done? There's some cost share programs that are available in the state of Oregon, and these are listed below. Okay, land strategy 4. You can also increase carbon in existing forests. And when I say forests, I also include the product system. So this is what's known as improved forest management, and there's a lot of potential worldwide. There's also a lot of potential in the US. Now, some examples include managing your rotation age at the culmination of mean annual increment. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's basically the period where at any given time, you basically have the next year of growth you have added on such that your total rotation carbon has now been increased. And then once trees start to slow down, then that sort of that feedback comes later and later, or smaller and smaller. There's also opportunities in soil carbon management, and there's actually been a lot of research in sort of honing in what might those strategies be. And there's opportunities for silvicultural improvements. So improving seed stock, improving site preparation, release from competing vegetations. One study has shown that these have been found to increase productivity in Douglas fir forests by up to 43%. So if you're growing trees faster, you're sequestering more. And you can either leave those in the forest or you can put more in the wood product piece. Now, this strategy is a little bit trickier than the other ones because there is a push-pull between how much goes into a product and how much stays in the forest. So if you stop harvesting, then you're reducing that ability to do these wood product related forest pieces. However, there's a lot of work that really shows that it's dependent on sort of the growth rate of your forest, what your risk of disturbance is, and whether or not there are leakage concerns. So if you're not harvesting your tree, where is the wood product coming from? Is it coming from the same state? Is it coming from an area around the world where you're actually reducing carbon stocks? Or are you now building your house out of concrete or steel? So all of these things kind of need to be looked at from a systematic viewpoint. And I think I have successfully raced through this presentation and am ready for all the questions that you guys have. Awesome. We're doing questions first, right?
We're doing it now, and then we'll also do some after David's. But these would be questions either for me or for Edie, and we got some already. So this one in here is from Ken Deniston. What happens to the carbon in soils after a stand is clear cut? Half of the carbon we have is in our soil. So if we clear cut, what happens to that carbon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want me to answer?
Sure. I'll let you answer it, and then I'll give you my 2 cents. But you're smarter than I am.
No such thing. That's a great question. So there's sort of 2 types of carbon in soils. There's the organic carbon that's kind of at the surface, and then there's the more stable carbon that's below. So generally speaking, the carbon at the surface is those tiny little roots, the litter that's decomposing, all of those things. There's a period of decay from those tiny little roots, right? So those decay quite quickly. Stuff that's on the ground, it really depends on your background temperature. The higher the temperature, the more those decompose, but there's some movement around there. But there's a lot of research showing that there's stuff that does kind of move its way down into the deeper, more stable. So that's really harder to measure. So there's a little more research that's going out there. And then, there's carbon that's stored in those stumps that do take a while to decompose. So there's those, some people call them the little carbon plugs. But generally there's going to be some decomposition once a tree, it's dead. So this is somehow they decompose. It's just a question of when.
Perfect. And I guess my answer to it would be the way to reduce loss is to reduce the time that it's not in forest. As quick as you can, get the trees growing, get the shrubs growing. But in addition to, what's stored in the soil, live roots become dead roots, become carbon. So that's a huge thing. And then I guess the other, as you're talking about leaving the woody biomass, that could be incorporated into the soil as time goes on. I think, especially I've run into this with new small woodland owners. They want the forest to look like a park. And they'll even pick up small limbs, out there after the storms we've had, people just cleaning up their forests. No. That stuff becomes soil carbon. So it's important not to overclean your forest. Yeah. So next question. What trees are better than others with respect to growth, carbon, et cetera, in terms of species, I think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Do you want your trees to grow super fast? There's an awful lot of trees around the world that can grow really, really, really fast. Do you want your tree to grow really long and store a ton of carbon? Well, you guys know you've got some trees that that can pack it on for a long period of time. So I think it really depends on what you want to do with the forest, whether or not you're managing for growing wood products, whether or not you are managing to store a lot of carbon. Really depends.
The other thing I would add to that one, Edie, is it really depends on, as you mentioned, your very beginning was to have a lot of carbon stored in your forest. It takes a healthy forest. And so you really need trees that are suited to the site. And as climate changes, that's changing a little. But certainly just because this is the fastest growing tree in the world doesn't mean that it's going to work everywhere. And so I always look at, given a site that you're reforesting, what's grown there in the past and done really well. And then also a mix of species. As we have things stressing our forests, every tree gets hit differently by diseases and insects. So having variety. So I think all those things need to be taken into account. All right. Does pruning limbs reduce the sequestration ability of a tree?
Not really, unless you are pruning too much of the crown. So,
Right.
You're pruning, normally you're taking off the limbs that already don't have the sunlight, and your goal is to do it to get clear wood. So you've reduced those knots. So
yeah, studies on growth, really, growth of the wood is another way to talk about carbon, is as long as the live crown ratio, which is the ratio of the height of the tree that's in limbs, is say 30% or more, that you're fine. And certainly 40% is good, but more than 40%, it really didn't increase at all. All you get is big limbs. So I think pruning definitely is not a problem. Good question. They get harder though. Carbon loss is faster after disturbance than carbon gain after disturbance. The adverse effect is more immediate than the long-term gain. Can selective thinning reduce this asymmetry? That is a tough question. I hope you can read it so I don't have to read it again.
Yeah, no, I see it. I see it. So, I mean, I think what we're referring to is potentially disturbance from fire, right? So if you have a overstock stand and you have a disturbance that goes in and it takes out most of the stand, the ability to sort of come back from that is going to be different than if you have a thin stand that would not wipe out the whole stand. So I think maybe that's what we're talking about, and that's generally a good strategy. Thinning is usually, with or without fire, it usually does then boost the productivity of the remaining trees.
So I was thinking of this one. I like that answer, but I was thinking, as usual, a little differently. So I'm thinking of immediately after the timber harvest, say for the first 10 or 15 years, you have this period where you're losing more carbon than you're gaining. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's one of the benefits of a longer rotation. If the worst part of the cycle is the first 10 years, if you're growing a 40-year rotation, that's 1/4 of your cycle. If you're growing a 100-year rotation, that's only 10% of your cycle. So to me, that's part of one of the advantages of a longer rotation. But how significant that is, I think really is going to depend on site, and it's going to depend on how quickly you get crown closure and all of those other things. But I think it really makes sense. What it says to me is maybe think about lengthening rotation, but also prompt reforestation, prompt occupancy of the site. The quicker you get crown closure, the quicker you move out of that establishment phase. All right, more good questions. Are there estimates of the carbon flux in the wood product storage pool, net change of incoming and outgoing? What can be done to improve storage longevity? And this one, I don't think we have the whole answer of until we look at that harvested carbon stuff, but maybe you've got as good a feel as any since you wrote our chapter on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that is really how kind of country level reporting is done and how the state level reporting will be done. So they're looking at the past production and the wood products that are leaving the wood product pool because they're done with their useful life, and then the incoming production. And generally speaking, so this is reported in the US every year. Generally speaking, we still have more going into the pool than is leaving. However, it definitely depends. It depends on the region, and it depends on whether or not you're harvesting less than you had in the past. So, for example, U.S. Forest Service has done these analyses just on their national forests. And that is not the case, right? Because they're harvesting way less than they were in the past. So there's more from that national forest wood product pool that is leaving than is coming in. What can be done to improve the longevity of storage? This is a great, great question. And in fact, I'm working on another project, and just today read a report and a study about what happens if you increase recycle rates and increase the length of time of a product in use. How much more carbon can you get at? And those are the strategies. I mean, there's a lot of good work done on building design on some of these new products, cross-laminated timber, mass timber. Generally speaking, there's this feeling that there's going to be a lot more recycling because you don't have to take out the nails of a 2x4. You can repurpose these big honks to other things. So innovation.
Innovation. Good. We could talk more on that one, but we got two more, and we're getting ready to switch into David. We got a couple more minutes though. So this is a tough one. And this is one that a lot of people have grappled with, from Nancy. What is the net sink of logging activities given the heavy fossil fuel use and the damage to soil during the process of logging?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question, and I actually did my PhD dissertation on the fossil fuel emissions from forest management. So it actually is not. It pales in comparison to that overall impact of the biogenic carbon piece. So there is fossil fuel use, obviously, in harvesting, and there's fossil fuel use in bringing that to manufacturing facility. There's fossil fuel use in manufacturing. All of those are in the life cycle assessments that are done of the products. Those are all incorporated in there. In terms of how you can improve those, there's a lot of great work that can be done in terms of best practices for logging. There's work on reduced impact logging, making sure that you're not damaging trees if it's not a clear cut, if it's thinning, what time of year your equipment is going in, that has a big impact on sort of compaction of soil. So follow the best management practices associated with logging.
Maybe to add on to that a little bit, channeling Maureen Putman here, if you get the report and read the chapter on wood products that she did, one of the big differences in thinking about the forest and the wood products is the substitution effect. So if you're building a house or a building with wood, you have all of this stuff we're talking about, but you're also not building it out of concrete blocks, and you're not building it out of steel. And that really is where some of the gains happen, because you may have some emissions in the logging and in the transportation, but in the production, it's much more positive. and looking at the alternatives. So that's something John Perez Garcia at University of Washington has done some great work on substitution that really makes effect. The last one before we go and introduce David. So David, get ready to get introduced. This is a really good one from John Wood. The OFRI study's total net sequestration with product storage doesn't seem to include the benefit of wood energy, displacing other fuels like fossil. Why is that? And I think that's a really good question. The wood energy industry has trouble getting proper credit for this, and certainly someone should take credit for it. So we do address in that chapter on wood products and energy, the amounts, but we haven't done that total added in. So that's a great suggestion, John. So when you think back on the chart I made that showed the forest sequestration, then it showed the wood product storage, then it showed the byproduct storage, we could have a whole nother thing that talks about wood for energy. We just assumed the wood that's used for energy goes back in, but we're not assuming things like torrefaction to make electricity or whatever. So I think I could definitely look at that as we do the next version. So cool. I love it when answers suggest more work. That's what we need, right? Well, thank you, Edie. We'll invite you back at the end if you will stop sharing. And David, welcome. And I will introduce you while you get your PowerPoint going. And we're on time, guys. So this is amazing. So David Ford is a professional forester with 44 years experience. In 2010, he founded L&C Carbon. He serves as president and CEO. L&C Carbon works with forest landowners and others to sustainably manage their properties, expand revenue streams, including selling carbon stored in trees in voluntary and regulated markets. David is also a senior fellow with the American Forest Foundation, which is the sponsor of the Tree Farm program, and they also have a forest incentive program, a carbon incentive program. So David, tell us about forest carbon markets.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Mike?
Can hear you, but I can't see you.
Yeah, so I think you have to turn on the video.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, let me do that. I think I can do that. What I have to do is ask you to, sorry. More, ask to start video. Now it should say, please start your video. Duh, amazing.
Great, thank you. Pleasure to be with everybody today. And Mike, thanks to you and OFRI for the opportunity to present today. What I'd like to talk about is a little bit about the forest carbon markets. And so what I'd like to do is provide an overview of the current and future markets for carbon and hopefully future co-benefits, provide a brief update on what's happening here in Oregon, and then hopefully we can get it as some Q&A here at the end. So, well, first, as I think all the participants here know, that forests offer a vital role as a natural mechanism to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere. And you'll hear the term working in natural lands, and forests are a major component of working in natural lands here in the U.S. and around the globe. And when you take a look at around the globe, forests account for 92% of all the terrestrial biomass globally. And as Mike was indicating in some of his earlier slides, U.S. forests and associated wood products together capture and store about 16% of the U.S. annual emissions from burning fossil fuels today. And that can change over time. And we've seen states like Montana and Colorado and Arizona go from net sinks to sources here in the last decade. And there's concern that more forest land in the U.S. will head that way due to issues around lack of forest management, due to drought, due to wildfire, and those kinds of impacts. But in the world where I spend part of my time, which is in the carbon market space, those that are looking to buy forest or buy offsets, carbon offsets to help offset their footprint, forests are the most sought after source of carbon offsets, both in the voluntary and the compliance market. And I think part of that has to do with people have a natural attraction to forest, and they like the idea of doing something that has some tangible benefit to it, as compared to buying methane offsets where you're putting manures in digesters. It's kind of hard to hug one of those digesters, but people do have a tendency to like to be out in the forest and appreciate the value of trees. Well, let me talk for a few minutes just about the types of carbon markets. So there's both voluntary markets and regulated markets. And here in the US, the major markets in the voluntary space are run by the American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, which is based in California. There is a little bit of gold standard, but not much, and the Voluntary Carbon Standard, which is referred to as VCS. And actually, they've recently changed their overall name to Verra. And then in the regulated space, there is the California Air Resources Board, or CARB as they refer to it. And then in the northeastern states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or called RGGI. But today, no forest protocol is available, although they are working on a forest protocol that's going to be similar, it appears, to what the California Air Resources Board under their cap and trade program operates today. I would say there is no question that carbon markets are alive, very active, and they're growing. And just to give you a snapshot, at the end of 2019, about 1.3 billion carbon offsets worth nearly $5 billion was transacted in the voluntary market up to date. And then when you look at the California cap and trade program, over 150 million carbon offsets have been registered, generating over $1 billion in transactions. And so that market is clearly alive and well. I've been involved in carbon markets since the Oregon Small Woodlands Association started Woodlands Carbon back in, I guess we incorporated that probably in 2009. Or late 2008. And so when you look over the last decade, that was obviously very early in the process of the carbon markets. It was a time when the Chicago Climate Exchange was just closing, and the California Air Resources Board and others were getting started. And there wasn't a huge amount of demand for carbon in the market in those days. And that picture, I think, has really dramatically changed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why. And it has to do with what are the market drivers that are driving that. And so I've organized these market drivers in a few segments, but the first one is government incentives or initiatives. And maybe some of you have heard of the carbon offset and reduction scheme for international air aviation. It's referred to as CORSIA. And CORSIA comes out of the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN-sanctioned organization. And the global airline industry got together and made some commitments to go carbon neutral growth from 2020 forward. And you can do that through some operational improvements and some aircraft technology improvements. But there's a significant gap between what can be done there and what's going to need to be offset related to emissions from fuel and operations to operate the international airline fleet. Obviously, with COVID over the last year, we had a little, obviously a downturn in how much emissions came out of that sector. But when you look at the projections going forward to 2040 or to 2050, there's a significant amount of growth that's going to be occurring there. And so the airline industry is going to be a significant player. As a matter of fact, when it gets up to speed in a few years, its demand for offsets are going to be effectively what the California Cap and Trade Program has done over the past 10 years. There'll be somewhere around 150 million tons of offsets that are going to be needed on an annual basis just to offset the aviation sector. There are also things out there. The federal government, now with the current administration in place, is looking at ways to address the federal government's footprint. And the states have been quite active over the last 4 or 5 years. They formed a group called the U.S. Climate Alliance. There are 25 states that are part of that. And they have a range of commitments that they've made. And those include looking at natural and working lands to help assess what contribution can natural and working lands in each of these states contribute to helping each of these states achieve their greenhouse gas emission goals. Oregon is one of those states, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a few minutes. But when you look at the other potential international markets beyond the airline industry, the international shipping industry, the Maritime Organization referred to as IMO, when you take a look at the top international container shipping companies, they generate over $200 billion annually. And they're all located in countries that ratified the Paris Climate Accord. And they are a significant demand that if they come on board, which they've been in talks to do a similar program as to what the aviation industry has done, about trying to minimize their footprint and go carbon neutral at some point in the future. And if they begin asking for offsets in the marketplace, again, that's another significant demand element. Another area that I looked at when I was working with OFRI on the markets piece of the research paper that was released by OFRI was looking at cloud computing. And so we're all familiar with storage on the cloud, and the amount of information that's being stored on the cloud today has grown exponentially and is expected to grow at a very, very quick clip going forward. And so by 2030, there's estimates that the carbon footprint could be equivalent to aviation industry's emissions from fuel. So it's a significant component, and most people haven't thought about it or talked about it. And we're starting to see that come to the forefront with some of the announcements that happened over the last year or so, referring to organizations like Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and others who have significant cloud computing footprints. So these are just some examples of market drivers when you look kind of at the global scale. And when you look at the private sector, there are a couple of drivers in the private sector which are driving demand. There's what we've referred to in the past as corporate social responsibility, or now there's a governance element associated with this as well. And so Wall Street, non-governmental organizations, particularly environmental organizations, and even the employees of corporations are putting expectations on large, particularly publicly traded corporations, to take their environmental footprint, and particularly their greenhouse gas emission footprint, seriously and do something about it. And so we're starting to see the results of some of that pressure from Wall Street, NGOs, and employees. And an example of that is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That you can check that out at sciencebasedtargets.org. And currently, there's 1,259 companies globally that have signed up to commitments to take action. And of those 1,259, 623 have already set science-based targets, specific targets for their actions, and 438 of them have committed to to actions that are going to help contribute to ensuring that we don't increase our temperatures by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is out of the Paris Climate Accord. Here in the U.S., of those companies that I just listed, there are 212 U.S.-based companies that are committed to specific actions and 119 that have already set targets. And these companies are like some of the largest global companies in the world that are coming from a whole range of key market segments, including technology, manufacturing, retail, pharmaceutical, agricultural, automotive, telecom, travel. And some names that you all know: Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, GM, Ford, PepsiCo, General Mills, Johnson & Johnson, Mars, McDonald's, Procter & Gamble, Facebook, Target. I could go on for, these are all significant sized companies and have made some serious commitments here just even in the last 12 to 18 months that are significant. And part of the challenge is these corporations have put these significant targets, including trying to achieve net zero, and yet there's not enough offsets in the marketplace to be able to address all those commitments at this point. So that's kind of an interesting situation that we're facing. In example of a couple local companies, Jackson Family Wineries, they own about 25% of all Oregon vineyards now. They're a California-based company, but they've been buying up wineries here, and they have set specific targets already. And another one is, of course, Nike, which is someone everybody knows, Nike here, based out of Beaverton, Oregon, that has a global reach. But here's an example of Walmart and the commitment that they just made. And it talks about how they are going to reduce their absolute scopes, absolute scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 35% by 2025 and 65% by 2030 from a 2015 base. And they're also going to work upstream, downstream, which is referred to as scope 3 sources, so their supply chains, by 1 billion tons between 2030 and from a 2015 base. All those kinds of reductions aren't possible through efficiencies. They're clearly offsets are going to have to play a role in that, and it's not clear exactly how big it is, but it is going to be significant. So let me switch gears for a second to say that, well, what does that really mean for the price of carbon offsets? One, I think there's going to be demand. Then the question becomes, well, what's the price going to be? And in the California Air Resources Board, or what we refer to as the cap and trade program there, the price of offsets today is somewhere between, depending on what kind of project you have, can range anywhere between $13 and $15 a ton. In the voluntary market, they're really all over the map, but forestry projects tend to get a higher dollar value. And I think it's pretty safe to say that at least I've seen a lot of carbon projects transact between $7 and $10 a ton here over the last year. And so the question becomes, what do those future values look like? And traditionally, the regulated market, the California Cap and Trade Program, has tended to receive a surplus or a higher value for their carbon offsets because they're referred to as regulatory grade. However, we're beginning to see some closure between the voluntary prices and the regulated market prices. And I think we're going to head towards more parity in those markets here over the next decade. So I think the future values, it's hard to predict. It's like trying to predict the price of oil or trying to predict the price of stock. But all the signs indicate that demand is growing and supply hasn't been growing as fast as demand. And there's some blockages in the pathway to develop and get projects third-party verified, which I can go into for those that are interested. But needless to say, it's my perspective that being in this market for 10 years, things look pretty bright, at least over the next decade or so, based on demand and based on the acceptance of a range of voluntary credits in the marketplace. There are also a lot of co-benefits associated with carbon projects, and the real question will be how do we monetize some of these co-benefits going forward? And we are looking at that. There's a group of us that are beginning to look at these questions through the American Forest Foundation's program to see how can we place a value and then actually measure what those co-benefits are and put a price around them to be able to stack those co-benefit values either with carbon prices or justify higher prices of a carbon offset that have clear co-benefit associated with them. So let me just spend the last few minutes here talking about Oregon. Many of you are aware of in Oregon here that that there was a run for a couple different legislative sessions, 2019 and 2020, to try to get a cap and trade bill passed by the Oregon legislature. After the second failure to get that passed, in the spring of 2020, the governor of Oregon decided to issue an executive order 20-04, and I'm not going to go into detail about this executive order, other than to say that the governor basically directed all the state agencies to figure out ways that they could look at ways to help the state achieve its greenhouse gas emissions. So what could they do in each of these different agencies to work on that, including the Oregon Department of Forestry? And so since that executive order was passed, the state agencies have all been working on plans to be able to describe what actions could they take to help reduce their footprint or reduce emissions effectively, as well as looking at ways to increase sequestration. And the Oregon Global Warming Commission, which has been around since 2007, was given some specific direction, and one of those directives was to take a look at the role of natural and working lands in Oregon and come up with a set of targets of what these natural and working lands could contribute to the overall greenhouse gas targets that were set out in the executive order. And so that process is engaged right now. That work is now underway. Oregon Department of Forestry, Department of Agriculture, and a few other state agencies are involved in that effort. Obviously, Department of Forestry looking at the forest component of that, which is significant based on how much forest we have in this state. And the goal is by the end of June of this year to have some targets set for at least what contributions forestry will have that will then be put together with other natural and working lands. And so I urge you to take a look at that and participate in the opportunity for the public involvement process that's going to be ongoing here. And you can follow that by going to the Oregon Global Warming site, and it's called keepcool.org. And I sent to OFRI a list of resources with website links that I think, Mike, will be posted. And some of those website links are there for you to be able to go check out what the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the work that they're doing on natural and working lands. So I'm going to stop there because I know that we want to have some time for Q&A, and I appreciate your time and attention and look forward to answering questions that you may have. So, Mike, back to you.
Good. Thank you, David. I got a couple for you and a couple for Edie. And there's plenty of room for more questions, and we're not short of time. So the first one for you, David, is you mentioned the American Forest Foundation incentive program, and I read about it in their materials, and it's real exciting. And I would love it to come to Oregon. And so my question is, when will it come to Oregon? And if that's not planned, what can we Oregonians do to put pressure on AFF to get it to come to Oregon?
That's a great question. And both Edie and I actually have been involved in the development of that. We both serve on the science team, and I serve on the policy program team as well. Currently, the program is being piloted in the state of Pennsylvania, and it's going to expand into the Northeast later this year, and then up into the Lake States next year. There are no plans to bring it to the West immediately, but those of us, Edie and I, who are the Westerners there, regularly pound the table and say, come west, come west. But the basic concept behind the program is essentially to identify specific forest practices that will sequester and store greater amounts of carbon than common practice might be. And the idea is that AFF, not too dissimilar to some of the NRCS programs, will pay an incentive for a landowner to implement a specific practice And then we'll and in doing so, the landowner provides the rights to the carbon for a certain period of time, and then the American Forest Foundation will, through their nonprofit that they've established, will monetize those credits and then be able to replenish the pot to be able to pay more landowners, additional dollars to expand the program, with the idea of trying to get up to 50 million acres of forest, small family forest landowners that are, I don't know what the exact acreage is, but we're effectively targeting landowners that are 2,500 acres or smaller, because that's the land segment of family forest owners that have a really difficult time participating in the current carbon offset programs, what we refer to as the traditional ones, which you really need 3,000 acres generally or more to be able to monetize or have enough credit generated to be able to pay for the cost to develop the project and to manage a project over time.
All right. Well, you just answered one of the other questions, but I'm going to read it again just in case you want to add to it. This is from Bruce Bull. Are there minimum numbers of acres of forests that are required for different offset programs? And at what point are they just too small that it's not practical to do it? And you said 3,000. Is that a good number?
Well, it depends. Like on the west side of Oregon, the city of Astoria, for example, we did a carbon project for them a few years ago. They've actually been at it for 5 years now. They have about 3,000 acres, but they also had a lot of volume. They have about 100 million feet on their 3,000 acres. So that made a pretty good carbon project. It's really a combination of both acres and standing volume. So Eastern Oregon, you need more acres because you have less volume per acre generally. Western Oregon, less acres, but more, but still, it's really tough to do a project under 1,500 or 2,000 acres, even on the west side, unless it's a really heavily stocked forest, because there's a lot of cost and expense. However, when we look at future technology, some of the biggest cost is going out and doing these intensive inventories to be able to measure carbon. And we know that technology is evolving, and we'll be able to do a lot of this work, hopefully remotely, through remote sensing techniques. But yeah, in the family forest carbon program that AFF is working on, it's really about paying a landowner and then aggregating a whole group of landowners together to get to scale. And under the traditional carbon programs like the American Carbon Registry and VERA, or the Verified Carbon Standard, there are aggregation programs, and some of us are working on a few, but we're still early days there. But still, there's long-term obligations and a lot of operating costs to be able to successfully make it work.
Good. So related question, and then I'd ask Edie to come back because I have a question for her. This one from Howard Richburg. If I sell part of my forest as a carbon offset, how long does that arrangement last? And can I still manage and harvest my forest? Good question.
So the simple answer to that is it depends on what program you're in. For the American Carbon Registry, which is the main voluntary program that's used here in the West, and there are a number of landowners that are under that program here. Those are 40-year commitments, but they're two 20-year crediting periods. So you can participate in the first 20-year crediting period, and then when you get to year 21, you can decide whether you want to continue on in the program or just monitor for the next 20 years to year 40. And as long as your carbon stock are at or above the carbon stock level they were at the end of the first 20 years, you're good. And so there are 20, and there are some programs that go up to 100 plus years, like the California Cap and Trade program, which just is not practical for 99.99% of family landowners.
Right. And in terms of selling or harvesting your timber, as long as you stay above that baseline, that's okay, right? You establish a baseline of so much, and any growth above that, you can harvest and sell. You just can't get below your baseline.
Yeah, and it's actually, you can't get below the level of carbon stocks that you've monetized in the marketplace. So it's not really a baseline. It's how much carbon. So as you have growth. So the key is, and as a matter of fact, most of these projects are what they call improved forest management. which means, and it's intended that you manage your property and do harvest. The key is if you're harvesting more than growth, that's not a good carbon project, because effectively what carbon you get to monetize is growth minus harvest over time.
Good. So Edie, are you there? Good. So this one I think is for you. How is it possible to estimate carbon in forest land giving so many variables regarding forest biodiversity?
That's a great question. So one of the key messages that I failed to make is that carbon is really one of many different ecosystem services that forests provide. Carbon is a quantity that can be measured, and it is in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the unit of measurement. But that does not get at it does not get at stream quality, water quality. It does not get at habitat, biodiversity, all of these other things. And often they go hand in hand, they're directionally, but they're not always. So you definitely don't necessarily need to have an overstocked carbon stand to have the greatest biodiversity benefit. Some like it, some don't. So I think this is a long-winded way of, you can measure carbon. You can absolutely measure carbon, but you should also be thinking about some of the other ecosystem services too.
Right, which is what David calls co-benefits, really important. So we're going to stick around. It's about 4:30. So those of you that need to leave can leave, but we will go into overtime, and we're committed to stay here till 4:45 in overtime. But two things I want to do before we go. One is to have everyone have a chance for the final poll. And while I'm starting the poll, David, maybe you can start the slides again and go to the slides that talk about the next tree schools. So I will launch the poll and then move it into the background for you all. What we do with this final poll is just get some feedback on the show today. So overall, the material in the presentation presented and discussed was very useful, neutral, not useful, totally not useful. Overall satisfaction with today's webinar was very satisfied, neutral, not satisfied, totally not satisfied. We never get any of those. People that are totally not satisfied leave before they get to the final poll. I've learned that. And then will you use the information in your work or leisure? So I will just minimize this. It'll stay open until the webinar ends. If you can go start that, David, so it'll get fuller. What do you call it? Start the show. You're sharing it, but we're still on the one slide. So next week's,
yeah, I see it.
No problem. The next Tree School Online is April 6th, and it features Alicia Peterson and Lauren Grand, and Lauren is in the audience today, and they're going to talk about native trees of Western Oregon, and that should be a really good one. I've seen this at regular tree school. I've taught it at Tree School Lane, and it's very good. Then we also have some webinars on the east side, and there's one coming up, but it just is blank, David.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here, Mike. Sorry.
Okay, that's
Can you see
okay.
the slide at all?
I can't, but I'll tell you what I will do is you try to get it back, and I have your presentation right here, and I can share it also. So why don't I just do that one? Sharing the screen now. Where'd it go? There she is. So the other webinar that's going on, can you all see this one? Tree School. Yep. In Eastern Oregon, they call it Managing the Forests of Eastern Oregon. And we have one coming up on managing slash and fuels on Thursday, March 18th, which is the day after tomorrow. Ariel Cowan is one of the new regional fire specialists in Central Oregon, really sharp lady. This would work as much in east side and west side as it would east side. But if you want to look at the options for managing slash and reducing fuels, this would be a great webinar for that. And then the other one that we have going on is this one I already mentioned, Native Trees of Western Oregon. And I hit the wrong direction. Okay, this is the one. The Extension Wildfire Program tomorrow is doing a program called It Takes a Village. Wildfire Wednesdays, they call it. And this is a webinar talking about the wildfire problem in Oregon, discussing risk, provide with resources and a plan. And it should be really good. So anyway, those are other webinars, and all of these are listed on either Extension or OFRI or both. So now we've paid the sponsor, we can get back to the program. Always got to do that. So this is an interesting question, and I've thought about this. This guy wants to know, Ken, if I buy offsets to cover my jet travel this year from a forest-based sequestration project, how long does it take for the forest to store the carbon that I burned?
Not very long.
That's what I would say.
So, yeah, so Westside Forest can sequester, 3 to 5 tons per acre of CO2 per acre per year. Eastside Forest, maybe a little bit less, right? Maybe 1 to 3 tons, depending on where they are. And air travel, you can go onto these various websites. United does it, and Delta and a few others, Hawaiian Airlines, and they'll tell you, you can put in how many air miles it is, and it'll do a little quick calculation for you. But it's a number of tons, right? It's like a couple tons, maybe per flight at the most. So not a lot.
We did a similar study looking at, had a building in Portland, and they wanted to know how long it took to grow the carbon that was stored in that building, and figured it all out. For the forests in Oregon, just our timberland, not even the forest land, it took 6 minutes to grow the carbon that's in a big building. So it's amazing what we can do here. So that's a great question. So this is a good question for you, David. Going back in history, you mentioned OSWA starting woodlands carbon after about a decade ago. I've been an OSWA member for a while, but not familiar with the program. Is there any more information or status on woodlands carbon?
Yeah, so Woodlands Carbon operated in the early 2000s, and I think we put about 11 landowners together in a pool and sold carbon here in the state to a couple different businesses in the state. And we did it as a pilot, and was funded through the American Forest Foundation. And that was kind of in the period between the time the Chicago Climate Exchange ended and new programs were coming online. And there was no method in the new programs like the American Carbon Registry or the California Cap and Trade Program to do aggregated pools. And we did an aggregated pool, and you have to do an aggregated pool. And so Woodlands Carbon ended up, closing probably in, I forget when it closed. It was probably 2014 or 2015. And so that no longer exists. But, it's an interesting program. What it demonstrated, there was interest. We learned a lot about it in the process. And, we're hoping that as we develop and more demand occurs for carbon offsets, that creating aggregated pools of smaller family landowners is something that we can bring back to Oregon. So.
All right. I've one for Edie, and then I got 3 more for David, but more can come in at any moment. So this one talked about storing carbon in the soil before. Can carbon be stored in the soil for agricultural products, such as grass seed and wheat, et cetera, or is it only in forests and prairies that we store carbon in the soil?
Oh, that's a great question. So in agriculture, the reason why carbon is generally not in the soil is because of tilling, right? You're harvesting the crop, and then you're getting ready for the next crop, and you're pulling it up and getting everything ready. So a way to increase carbon in soil in agriculture is going to no-till farming. And there's a lot of protocols that are trying to be developed. I think some are already developed specifically to get at these different types of soil management techniques so that you do increase carbon in soil in agriculture. Grasslands actually do have a lot of soil carbon, and it depends on the grass. Some have really deep root systems. So it does depend, but forests generally generally speaking, has more carbon in soil than other land uses.
Good answer. All right, David. This is a question from a banker. So Chad asks, David, obviously the carbon market differs from the log market, but how does the current voluntary offset market at $7 to $10 translate in the industrial owner's mind at dollars per MBF, which last time I looked was over 800? So how do we equate $800 per MBF to $10 per ton?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So the simple answer is carbon values and stumpage values are not equal. They're not equal. And the question becomes, though, and they never will be, honestly, I don't think. I mean, if carbon got to the price of $50 a ton, and you began looking at log prices and carbon prices, and you put it into a harvest scheduler that wants to optimize NPV, when you get dollars up in the $50 range, your harvest scheduler is going to stop harvesting trees because it's going to say the trees are more valuable on the stump than they are, depending on the value of the stumpage. In today's world, where stumpage prices are really high, carbon can't compete. But what carbon can be is a layer of value. So if you don't plan to harvest all your growth on your property, and most family landowners don't harvest 100% of the growth, even in an industrial setting, it's very difficult to actually harvest 100% of your growth every year. It's just a difficult thing to do. But if your objective is to harvest a smaller rate than your growth, then you can have harvest and carbon. You can have your cake and your icing on top, and so that's an option that people should look at. And the challenge up to this point is the carbon values haven't been significant enough to get people's attention based on the return for investment or the return for risk. And there's a lot of risk in carbon projects. And if there isn't sufficient reward, not as many people will participate. But I would tell you, as a project developer, we get calls regularly today that 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, we would go a week on end without any calls. So the world's changing.
It is. Good answer. I like the way you think about the icing on the cake. So Edie, you mentioned tree planting, you mentioned improved forestry, it might be interpreted as longer rotations. It seems to me that if you're planting seedlings, it takes a long time to get to the amount of carbon that you would get, say, instead of growing a 40-year-old stand, growing a 50-year-old stand. So how do you equate the different ways to increase sequestration? Where's the place we should be really focusing?
Oh, that's a great question. I thought you were so. I thought it was more of a question for David, because one of the key things is that it is sequestering, right? So, and that's what you're really focused on. The key is that there's a cost. So there's a significant cost in the replanting or the planting in the first place, that you don't actually get that full carbon value. You're just getting a little bit every year. And so those in the carbon market, those practices are typically not as well used as, say, an improved forest management of increasing rotation age, because you've already got that. There's no cost to letting a tree. I mean, there's an opportunity cost, but there's not a cost to letting a tree grow longer. The sequestration can be similar. It's just in little bits and pieces. There's also a whole other element of, frankly, the nuances associated with the protocols that David very eloquently was able to to not have to go into the details. But there's an element of what you're actually, whether or not you're holding something above what a common practice would be. In which case you're getting a payment for essentially to agree to hold that there. But you don't actually have to plant a new tree or have an upfront cost associated with it.
All right. But we got time for one more question, and there are two more in the box. So David, look at them both together. And the first part is talk about the elements in a carbon contract. And then kind of at a follow-on to that, this Forest Carbon Works out of California is doing carbon contracts with smaller acreages as low as 115 acres. How can they do that? So what are the elements and how?
Yes, let me start with that. Let me start with that one first. I don't know how they can do that. There's only one example that I'm aware of, so that should tell you something. Because there's a carrying cost of under the California cap and trade program, there's a carrying cost of 125 years. And after you monetize for the first 25-year crediting period, you are required to monitor and report every year for the next 100 years with no income. On 115 acres, I don't know how that's economically feasible to do. It's hard to do it on, 10,000 or 20,000 acres, to be honest. So I don't know enough about that program, but it's an interesting one to look at. As far as the elements of a basic contract, each contract basically says you calculate, as Edie put it quite clearly, you take a look at what your existing stocks are as compared to what a common practice may be or a calculated baseline depending on the protocol. And you can get a benefit for having stocks above a baseline or a common practice in the first year or several years of a program. And then from that point forward, you effectively get annual growth minus annual harvest. And so the contract itself basically has a set of requirements. It requires you to report. It requires you to re-inventory every certain number of years under the American Carbon Registry, for example, the one that I work with a lot. Every 5 years, you have to re-inventory, and you have to have a third-party verifier come to the ground and verify that your carbon is still there and your calculations are correct based on the inventory. And so there's these basic reporting requirements. And then if you don't live up to those obligations, there's penalties. So there's penalty sections that say if you decide you want to leave the program, then you got to repay all the carbon stocks. So for example, if carbon is selling for $10 today and in 10 years it's selling for 20, well, maybe you don't want to leave the program because you can make money. But let's say it's selling at $1, you can leave the program, basically replace all the credits that you sold for $10 for $1, and you can leave the program with the $9 per credit profit. So there are some protections for both ways. There's upside opportunity and there's exit ramps, if you will, in these programs. If you want to leave the program, just recognizing you have to understand what those penalties really look like.
All right. Well, we're out of time. So thank you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Edie. Thank you, audience. And let me just share the screen that shows the next tree school, because we all want you all to come again and sign up. And this is April 6th, Alicia Christensen and Lauren Grand, Native Trees of Western Oregon. So with that, I'm going to end it and say thank you all and have a great evening. Enjoy the sunshine.